Hi folks, HR Funk here with a handgun that I have wanted for a long time. What I am holding here is the Smith & Wesson 357 Magnum revolver. Now some of you might have just heard me say that and you're thinking to yourself, wait a minute HR Funk, don't you mean you're holding a Smith & Wesson 357 Magnum revolver? Because after all, they chamber quite a few different models for that cartridge. No, I meant it exactly the way I said it. This is the Smith & Wesson 357 Magnum revolver. In fact, for over 20 years, it was simply known as the Smith & Wesson 357 Magnum revolver. This revolver and the cartridge it chambers really were inspired by the work of handgunners and reloaders from the early part of the 20th century. It was developed for law enforcement officers during a time when they were dealing with the likes of John Dillinger, Pretty Boy Floyd, Bonnie and Clyde, Lester Gillis, and all the rest. It was really the first handgun to capture the imagination of handgun hunters and to prove to the shooting world that the revolver, or handguns in general, were capable of far more power than anyone ever thought before. This was the first handgun, or the first firearm, truthfully, to ever have the appellation of Magnum applied to it. This is the N-frame 357 Magnum 6-shot revolver that we know nowadays as the Model 27, but as you'll see shortly, this revolver is a bit of a throwback, and I can't wait to get into it. I'm going to tell you about this revolver specifically. I'm going to tell you about some of its history, so let's get to it. Here we go. When Smith & Wesson first began to manufacture the 357 Magnum revolver, they did quite a bit to help promote it. One of the things they did was award the very first one off the assembly line to J. Edgar Hoover, at that time director of the FBI, well, at that time and for many years thereafter. And I believe this became the official issued revolver of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Somebody's going to have to fact check me on that, but I think it was, I know it was used by members of the Bureau, and I think this was their official issue. Also, the president of Smith & Wesson at that time, who was the grandson of the company's founder, Daniel Wesson, took one of these revolvers, I believe his had a much longer barrel, on a very highly publicized worldwide hunting trip and used it to take a lot of big game, thereby cementing the idea in the mind of the shooting public that this was a very powerful revolver chambered for, obviously, a very powerful cartridge. There were some notable Americans who had these revolvers, and price-wise, they were beyond the reach of a lot of shooters. These, when they first were introduced, sold for the hefty price of $60, and they were essentially a custom order item. These revolvers could be had with barrel lengths anywhere from 3.5 inches to 8 3/4 inches, and they were available at 1/4 inch increments, depending upon exactly what someone wanted. So if they wanted a 3 3/4 inch barrel, or they wanted a 6 3/4 inch barrel, or 5.5, or whatever, they could have exactly the barrel length they wanted. Also, they could order it with whatever sights they wanted, stocks, there were finish options. And when these were received, there was a registration number that was stamped into the yoke cutout. And there was also a certificate in the box that the new owner could send back to Smith & Wesson, and they would send a registration form to that owner, essentially registering that revolver to that particular owner. Those were known as registered magnums, and nowadays they go for very high prices if you can even find one. This is not a registered magnum. This, in fact, is a new production revolver. And when we start to take the close-up look at it, you're going to see some things that, as I said a moment ago, are throwbacks to the older revolvers. This really is pretty similar in many respects to a post-war 357 Magnum revolver that would have been produced from about 1946 to about 1956. And they did suspend production during World War II when Smith & Wesson was engaged in production of firearms for the military effort. Speaking of World War II, no less than General George S. Patton had a 357 Magnum revolver. He had a 3.5 inch registered Magnum. And if you ever look at the double gun rig that General Patton carried, on one side was his Colt Single Action Army, on the other was his 3.5 inch registered 357 Magnum. I think he called it his killing gun, if I remember correctly, which is kind of funny. These revolvers have a very rich and storied history, and I am extremely happy to have one now. thanks to the folks at House of Pain Armament. That's where I got this one. I had to do some trading and some wheeling and some dealing because these are still not inexpensive. And the reason I've never had one prior to this is because the price always was prohibitive. Still, these days, this one is an expensive handgun, but it's not as expensive as the originals. And as I said, I'm extremely happy to have it. So now let's get on with that close-up look. And this is the way you bring the .357 Magnum revolver home with you from the store in one of Smith & Wesson's hard plastic cases. And Smith & Wesson has been moving away from these in the last few years and going more to just a standard cardboard carton. But for revolvers and semi-autos that are a little bit higher in their production line, they are still using these hard cases. And there's virtually nothing else significant inside the case. So I'm just going to move it off to the side. You do get an owner's manual and some other paperwork and what have you, but that's it. There's nothing else in there, no cleaning gear, no nothing. Now, some of you know that I have been pretty vocally critical of Smith & Wesson for the last couple of years. I've been a lifelong Smith & Wesson fan, and I've just been very disappointed with some of the products that they have been putting out recently. But this is one that I have to give them props for because I think they did this right. This is about as close to a post-war Smith & Wesson .357 Magnum revolver probably as they can produce today. And I'll show you as we start to look closer and closer at some of these features. If you look very closely at this revolver and some of those from back in the late 1940s and early 1950s, you'll probably be able to see a few differences in parts and some of the contours and one thing and another, but overall this is a very close representation of one of those old-time wheel guns. So we'll start things off with just a look at the bluing on this revolver. And this is maybe not quite to the level of the revolvers of yesteryear, but this is some of the best bluing I've seen on a Smith & Wesson revolver, or any revolver for that matter, in a long, long time. We can see the high polish and the deep blue, and I'll swap this around so you can see the other side as well. And there's a look at the port side. Again, you can see that very high polish and deep bluing on there, which is extremely eye-catching. Again, this is some of the best bluing I've seen in a long, long time on any revolver, to include those from Smith & Wesson. Now, I should probably specify that this is a Model 27, technically. It is a Model 27-9. Now, for any of you who don't understand the dash numbers, when the revolvers were originally given model numbers, which was in 1957, they all had just whatever the model number was. A Model 27 was this particular revolver. The .44 Magnum became the Model 29. The Combat Masterpiece became the Model 15, and there were many others. As Smith & Wesson made alterations to the design in the following years, they would add the dash numbers to indicate that an alteration had been done to the original design. So if you have a revolver that just has the model number with no dash, that's the way it was originally built by the factory. If you have something that has a -1 or a -2 or what have you, that just indicates how many alterations to the design had been incorporated from the time that revolver was originally introduced. Now, as I said, this is a -9. But most of the alterations to the design over the years are in places where you can't really see them. Now, there are a few. The contour of the front sight is one thing that you can spot pretty quickly. Obviously, the lock on the other side is something you can spot pretty quickly. But overall, the appearance of this is very, very close to those revolvers that were originally introduced back in 1935. And we'll start our top-down close-up look at the .357 Magnum revolver with the sights. The rear sight is Smith & Wesson's micrometer click adjustable unit that is serrated to keep down glare. Right here, you can see that at the very back. The front sight is also serrated to keep down on glare, and it is a ramped front sight. There is no insert of any kind. It is a pinned front sight blade. So if you want to change to a different height, all you have to do is drive out that pin, remove this sight, put the different sight in, replace the pin, and you have your new front sight, whatever you might want. Something I want to point out, and I really hope that it shows up in the video, it looks like it's going to, is the checkering on the top strap that you see here, and the checkering is continued onto the barrel rib. This is not grooved or lined, this is actually checkered. The 357 Magnum / Model 27 was the only Smith & Wesson revolver to ever incorporate the checkering on the top strap and barrel rib. Again, when this was first introduced back in 1935, it was a flagship revolver. It was meant to be essentially the Cadillac wheel gun of the Smith & Wesson line, and this was something they did to really help set it off. It has always been a hallmark of the 357 Magnum end frame revolver, specifically this one. Now, the Model 28 that came later also is a 357 Magnum end frame, but this one that became the Model 27 has always had that checkered top strap, and I was extremely happy to see that was still incorporated on this new production revolver. This revolver does have a 4-inch barrel, and you can see the contour here going from the frame down to a smaller barrel diameter. That's another thing, and there you can see it much better. That's another thing that is a throwback to the revolvers of the old days. Typically they had that tapered barrel. If you see an old M&P revolver, they had a very tapered barrel. They would call them pencil barrels back in the day. But you don't see this a lot these days. A lot of the revolvers have very heavy barrel that are all the same diameter, and this one still has that tapered barrel. Again, I'm very happy to see that. It also has the full ejector shroud that you can see there. The font on this revolver is maybe not quite what it once was in the old days, where you see Smith & Wesson 357 Magnum on this side and Smith & Wesson on this side, but it also doesn't quite look like the brand new revolvers or the more modern revolvers that you see now. It's somewhat of a throwback to the font and the lettering that was used back in the day, and I'm happy to see that, and very glad to see that it's not laser engraved or anything crazy like that. Here you can see the cylinder release on this 357 Magnum revolver. And if you've seen any of the more recent production revolvers, you know that Smith & Wesson has gone to a cut-down cylinder release. It is not nearly this size. This is a throwback, once again, to those traditional revolvers from years ago. It is the full-size thumb piece for the cylinder release, and is also finely checkered to help with traction when you are applying that to release the cylinder and open it. The trigger has a grooved face. This is a .260 width trigger. Again, this is the same as those revolvers from back in the late 1940s and into the 1950s. Eventually, this was replaced by a smooth trigger, and most of the Smith & Wesson revolvers today have that smooth trigger, which works very well for double action, but this gives you a little bit more traction, especially for single action firing. This is more of a target trigger that is being used. Similarly, we see the checkered target style hammer, or at least hammer spur here. Now, one change that you'll see is that there is no longer a hammer nose. That's something that was changed many years ago, and obviously they weren't going to change that back. So that is a departure from the revolvers of the old days, but it's one that several of my newer revolvers have, so I can live with it on this one, but I would have preferred to see that hammer nose when I cock the hammer. The grips that you see here are Smith & Wesson's Magna Grips. These were introduced in late 1935, or grips of this particular style were introduced in late 1935, with the idea that the extra grip material would help with the Magnum recoil when it came to controlling the firearm. If you ever see older revolvers from pre-1935 from Smith & Wesson, you'll see that there is just a grip portion at the lower part of the grip frame, and this part is not up here. So that was an addition for the 357 Magnum revolvers, hence the name Magna stocks. Later on, these would be replaced by even larger target stocks on the Model 27, but this would once again be appropriate to those post-war production 357 Magnum revolvers of yesteryear. Another nice touch with these Magna stocks can be seen right here, this diamond shape around the grip screw escutcheon. This was present in the Magna Grips from the time they were introduced in late 1935 up until 1968, when for whatever reason Smith & Wesson stopped manufacturing the grips with that diamond shape and went to having just checkering, or in some instances the grips were all smooth. And as I said a little while ago, eventually they replaced it altogether with the larger target stocks. Also, with those original 357 Magnum revolvers from back in 1935 and all the way through the production of the Model 27, there was a grooved front strap on the grip frame and a grooved rear strap, or back strap rather. Now, there were originally only 6 grooves on the back strap and front strap, and then at some point, I'm not sure when, it was changed to 10 grooves, and we can see this is the 10 grooves on both the front strap and the back strap of this revolver. Here's a look at the Smith & Wesson trademark engraved onto the side plate. This is something that changed back and forth over the years. For some revolvers, they were on the side plate just like this one. During other times, the trademark was moved to this area just below the thumb piece for the cylinder release, and it was a smaller trademark. For these newer revolvers, Smith & Wesson decided to keep them right there on the side plate. Another nod toward modernity can be seen right here. The original revolvers had a pinned barrel, and you would see a pin through the frame right here, keeping the barrel in place. That was dropped circa 1980, 1981, thereabouts. At the same time, Smith & Wesson also did away with the chamber counter bores that you see are not here. So this is not a pinned and recessed revolver. And I guess I'm not really surprised by that. That would have probably been just too much work to go back and re-engineer that, but at least they kept most of the flavor of the old revolvers in this one. It also has a lockup at the front of the ejector rod that we can see right there. And speaking of lockup, the lockup for this revolver is very, very tight. There is virtually no movement, maybe just a tiny bit, nothing forward and backward, and just the slightest bit of rotational movement there. So very, very good tight lockup on these. This revolver also has the more modern extractor star. If you're familiar with these revolvers, you know the older ones had a different shape, and there was also a pin in the cylinder itself to keep them in place. The newer ones, and this was a change that came around circa 1999, 2000, somewhere back in that era. And it would have been one of the revision numbers, but this does have the more modern extractor star. Another hallmark of the end-frame 357 Magnum revolvers can be seen right here, that very large forcing cone. These revolvers were built to be very, very strong and to last for a lifetime's use with that full power 357 Magnum ammunition, and by and large they very well did that. Here you can see one of my favorite design characteristics of this revolver, and it's one of those things that's probably really going to only excite a Smith & Wesson revolver geek like me, and that is the addition of this 4th screw to the top of the side plate. Now, this is not a new characteristic of this revolver, and this is why I say that this model most closely approximates a post-war revolver that would have been made between 1946 and about 1956, because this was in the original revolvers that were manufactured, but it was deleted from this design in 1956. Now, that was a year before this revolver became known as the Model 27. So it really harkens back to those revolvers of old, those late 1940s and early 1950s 357 Magnums. And ironically, this required a dash number to be added to the model. This is a Model 27-9, and the -9 was the re-inclusion of this 4th side plate screw, which I think is ironic. So if that's my favorite characteristic that was added by a design modification, I'll turn the revolver around and show you my least favorite characteristic that was added by a design modification, and that is the lock right there that was added with -6 or -7, I don't remember off the top of my head. But that's one that I wish they would have deleted when they decided to re-include that 4th side plate screw. The only good thing about the lock is that on the blued revolvers, it doesn't show up quite as much as it does on the stainless steel revolvers. So at least it's a little less conspicuous. But I really do like the fact that they added that fourth side plate screw. Some of you might have noticed the turn line that's already becoming visible on the cylinder right there. That is my doing. It did not look like that when I first brought it home from the store. I have been dry firing this revolver quite a bit. When I first brought it home, the action felt pretty stiff, and I probably dry fired it 300 times, give or take by now, and the action is already feeling smoother. I'll be doing some more dry firing with it, and eventually I am going to go out and shoot it, so we'll get to see some range results. I'm also going to see if I can get a trigger pull weight with my Lyman trigger gauge. I'm not sure if it's going to read the double action pull yet or not. That might be over 12 pounds. We'll find out. But we definitely should be able to see where the single action trigger is breaking. Okay, I'm going to see if I can get a trigger pull weight on the double action pull, or for the double action pull. And nope, not going to do it. It's already over 12 pounds. So I'm going to keep working with that. I have a feeling with a little bit more dry firing, when I go out and do some actual live firing with it, we'll probably get down eventually to where I can measure that. But for now, all I can tell you for certain is that it's over 12 pounds. Let's see where the single action pull is breaking. Close to 5 pounds. So again, this is heavy for a Smith & Wesson revolver, and I think with some time and with some work, we're going to see those levels come down. If not, then I might be sending it off somewhere to get an action job, because I know these revolvers are capable of very, very good actions. Speaking of the action, I can show you the timing at least, which is also quite good. We see each cylinder locking up just before the hammer falls, which is right where that should occur. Same with the single action, just before the hammer makes it to full cock, we see that the cylinder is locking. So the timing is very good. Action's a little heavy at this point, but I got a feeling that's going to improve as time goes by. And here is one last close-up look at this .357 Magnum revolver before we wrap up the video. So there you go, folks. That is the close-up shop review of my new Smith & Wesson .357 Magnum revolver. Again, this is one that I think they got right. I could do without that lock, yes. That's one of the revisions I wish they could take away, but it looks like they are here to stay. But otherwise, I really, really like this wheel gun. There is going to be a range review, and that's going to be at some point in the future when the weather gets much better. This revolver is never going to see rain, never going to see snow. So I'm going to treat it very, very well, but I am going to shoot it. I did not get it to be a safe queen. In any case, if you have any questions or comments about this video, as always, make sure you forward those to me. Remember, if you purchase anything from Optics Planet, be sure to use my discount code, which is... And if you use that discount code, it's good for 7% off your purchase from Optics Planet. Also, remember the discount code from House of Pain, either House of Pain Armament or House of Pain Munitions. It doesn't matter because my discount code applies to either one. You can go there and use my discount code and save yourself some money off your purchase from House of Pain. And remember the Target sponsor for the channel, folks. Go to Target's online, check out their inventory, and see if they have anything that's going to meet your Target needs. See you next time, folks. And until then, hopefully with a classic wheel gun, good shooting. Bye-bye.